I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that morning as though it were pressed between the pages of an old book, its edges browned and faintly perfumed with damp stone. October had drawn a thin veil over Oxford, a mist so fine it seemed to drift from the river itself. I had walked early, before the calls and papers and the small abrasions of duty began. The bridge at Magdalen has always been a place where the city's pulse softens. The bell towers recede, the cobbles flatten, and the river under you carries more than water. Fragments of overheard Latin, the dust of lectures, secrets that never left the cloisters. I was leaning against the balustrade, hands deep in my coat, when I saw her. A slender young woman in a librarian's cardigan, her bicycle propped against the stone, head tilted as if listening to something beyond the wind. I noticed the way she held a small diary open in her palm, the pencil poised above a blank page yet unmoving. She was alone, or appeared to be, though she half-turned at intervals, frowning into the mist. Later I would learn her name, Joanna Field. At that moment she was simply a figure suspended between river and college, a quiet shape on a quiet bridge. I was not following her, not yet. I was only passing through, though my habit of watching, of noticing, is as involuntary as breath. The students came next, a murmuration of bicycles and scarves, their chatter scattering like starlings. I caught fragments, a lecture on Milton, an overdue library, fine, and then her pencil moved. She wrote quickly, almost furtively, as if recording a sound before it escaped. I saw her lips form a word, though not enough to read it. I think I heard it then, or thought I did. A low ripple, something between a cough and a chuckle, from the cloistered gardens beyond the bridge. Not loud, but placed oddly in the air as though projected. I glanced across the water to the grey walls of St. Anselm's. The windows were shut, no one leaned from them. The mist held everything too softly for echoes. She stiffened at the same moment, the pencil stilled. Her head turned sharply to the left, scanning the balustrade where only a pair of damp pigeons stood. I watched her inhale, as if bracing for words that never came, then close the diary and slip it into her satchel. The deduction, if you can call it that, was only a flicker. She did not look up to the windows as one would if hearing laughter from above. She looked behind her, at the open air of the bridge. The sound she heard had no origin she could name. Rain began to fall in a fine invisible pattern, a hiss more than a patter. She unlocked her bicycle and walked it off the bridge, head bowed. I followed with my eyes until she vanished into the arch of a college gate. I remember thinking, though I could not explain why, of a crossword clue I had been stuck on the night before. Heard but unseen, source of mirth. 6. No answer had come to me then. Even now, as I stood in the damp morning, the letters refused to settle. I lingered a moment longer, pretending to study the river. The punts lay moored like exhausted insects, oars crossed, leaves caught in the hulls. The smell of wet paper drifted from some unseen window where a printer was running. In Oxford, even the weather seemed to cite its sources. When I finally walked on, the laughter, if laughter it was, had faded entirely. Yet the air retained a peculiar tension, as if something had been said but not understood. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of mist and imagination, but I noted her bicycle's registration sticker without meaning to, the digits arranging themselves in my mind like half-solved clues. By evening, the incident had receded into the habitual fog of my days. Only later would it return, sharpened by death and circumstance, and I would recall that morning as the first movement of a piece whose theme I had heard, but could not yet name. 2 days after the morning on Magdalen Bridge, I sat alone in the Randolph bar, with a measure of Lafroig and a newspaper folded at a clean right angle. The wood paneling smelled of polish, and the faintest ghost of old cigars. Rain bruised the windows in slow, uneven taps, and the fire in the grate hissed at each fresh drop from the coats of passing tourists. The city outside was swollen with umbrellas. Inside, only the low murmur of a barman counting change and the clink of ice against glass. It was there I read of Lionel Kerr. The article was unassuming, tucked below a report on a rowing accident. Retired professor of Anglo-Saxon dies at All Souls. The words offered little but the barest sketch. A distinguished career, a fondness for medieval riddles, a funeral to be arranged privately. But a smaller line caught me beneath the ribs. Police received reports of a woman screaming, though no one was present at the scene. No further comment. I read it twice, as one might run a thumb over a bruise. The combination was too dissonant to dismiss. A man who had dedicated his life to the study of half-lost words dies quietly in his rooms, while a disembodied voice rings out elsewhere. I felt the hairs rise along my wrist as I set down the glass. The whiskey left a bright seam in the throat, the way certain lines of poetry do, unbidden and exact. There was a photograph accompanying the article, cropped tightly around Kerr's face. A pale man with an ascetic mouth, eyes like spent coins. He had lectured once or twice during my undergraduate days. A guest session on Exeter book riddles, I recalled vaguely. The memory rose with the smell of dust and vellum, a room in which every cough had seemed amplified. Kerr had spoken of the Old English word for laughter, explaining how it carried a shadow of pain within its etymology. A couple at the far end of the bar laughed softly. It was nothing, yet it made the newspaper tremble in my hands. I turned back to the article, tracing the printed words with a thumb as if they might rearrange themselves into sense. The coroner's brief statement, heart failure, no suspicious circumstances, read like an ill-fitting gloss. No mention of who heard the scream or where precisely. Only that odd phrase, at no one. A woman screaming at no one. Lewis would have shrugged, suggested a drunk, a prank, a student's theatrics. But I have always found coincidence a cowardly word. I finished the whiskey slowly, letting the peat settle behind the eyes, and began to play with the crossword on the next page. The clue at the center, marginal note that outlives its author. 8. I penciled nothing. A footnote, perhaps, but 8 letters. I let it dangle. The bar clock chimed the hour, a dull ecclesiastical note. Outside, a group of academics hurried past in gowns wet as kelp, their briefcases glinting under street lamps. Through the misted window they appeared like figures from some illuminated manuscript whose margins had blurred. I thought then of Joanna Field on the bridge, writing quickly as though time itself might erase her. The image slid against Kerr's death like 2 pieces of glass held up to the same light. Laughter and scream, unseen presences. A footnote no one had written yet. I folded the paper carefully, aligning its edges, and set it beside the empty glass. The deduction, if any, was only a flicker, that the story of Kerr's death had already been annotated by something unprintable. The scream, like a gloss scrawled in a medieval margin, hinting at a meaning the text refused to yield. When I stepped out into Beaumont Street, the rain had eased to a fine spray, the kind that lingers on stone and darkens it to ink. The colleges stood behind their gates like mute witnesses. Somewhere in the distance, a siren moaned briefly and fell silent. I walked toward the cab rank, telling myself it was too early to be curious, that I had cases enough without adding another. Yet in the pocket of my coat, the folded newspaper grew damp at the edges, as though trying to seep into my skin. That night, long after I should have been asleep, I found myself at my desk with the crossword still open. Marginal note that outlives its author. 8. I wrote in footnote, crossed it out, then penciled palimpsest. The letters fitted. I stared at the word until it blurred, aware of some half-formed echo moving through the case like a voice in a cloister, and realized I had already begun. The gate to St. Anselm's had the weight of secrecy in its hinges. Lewis pushed it open with a muttered remark about old locks, but to me it felt like entering a footnote of the city, a place where sentences began but never quite ended. The garden lay within. Low hedges clipped to a scholar's precision, gravel paths in pale loops like marginalia. Autumn had arrived here before it touched the high street. The air smelled of wet stone, fallen apples, and the paper of unopened letters. We walked slowly, my limp disguised as deliberation, Lewis's notebook flicking open at intervals. He had the blunt patience of a man who sees walls and not cloisters, but even he paused at the Latin carved into a lintel. Clauditur hic vita, sed non scientia. Life closes here, but not knowledge. The phrase was too neat for chance. I let it settle in the back of my mind with the crossword I had yet to finish. Joanna Field was waiting near the sundial, her bicycle propped discreetly against a yew. In daylight, she looked younger than on the bridge, yet the same tension moved across her features, as if each word she spoke had to be weighed for echo. She said she had catalogued Kerr's books, that he had left requests for volumes long out of print. When Lewis asked about the night of the disturbance, she glanced at me rather than him, explaining softly that she had heard laughter. Not a scream, though perhaps the sound had changed as it traveled. She said she had written it down because otherwise no one would believe it. Her hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. The deduction flickered there. Not fear, but some private shame at being noticed. We left her with the sundial and walked on, the gravel whispering underfoot. A tall man in a tweed jacket emerged from the colonnade, cigarette unlit, expression amused and sour in equal measure. Marcus Baines introduced himself as though doing us a favor. His voice carried the polish of lectures and the edge of debts not yet paid. He called Kerr a tedious relic who clung to old texts, then added, almost idly, that Kerr had threatened to expose his gambling at the Doncaster races. The way he spoke of it, half shrug, half dare, told me the threat had cut close. He flicked his cigarette back into its case unlit, a small contradiction I filed away. Beyond the next archway stood Eleanor Ross, the classics tutor. She held a pile of essays against her chest as if they were a shield, her hair pinned with exactness. She said she had not loved Kerr for years and said it with a clarity only possible when the opposite remains partly true. She remarked on his habit of quoting Latin wrongly to provoke correction. When she walked away, the essays stayed pressed to her like a relic. I noticed a faint smudge of ink on her wrist, shaped like a question mark. Anthony Miles arrived last, a figure out of place among the cloisters, his overcoat expensively informal, his smile polished as the brass on the chapel door. He spoke of endowments and transparency, of his plan to fund a new library wing in Kerr's honor, though no one had yet asked him to. He avoided my eyes when I inquired about his connection to the manuscripts. He said Kerr had been grateful, always grateful. The words sat between us like a coin no one wished to pick up. Lewis scribbled while I drifted a step behind, letting the college breathe its muted history over me. Footsteps echoed, then died. The carved Latin repeated itself across arches like a refrain. Leaves skittered along the path with the sound of pages turning. Each of them, librarian, philologist, tutor, benefactor, moved through the garden as if rehearsing an alibi rather than a stroll. We stopped at a bench beneath a copper beech whose roots buckled the flagstones like hidden text pushing through the page. I thought of the crossword clue waiting on my desk, bound but still speaking. 6. It might be book, might be ghost. Watching their silhouettes retreat into doorways, I felt the answer hover just out of reach. In that closed garden, their lives seemed bound indeed and yet still speaking, if only one knew how to read the margin. The porter's lodge smelled of polish and rain-damp wool. Afternoon light slanted through the mullioned window, making the register's ink glisten like a secret just spoken. I had asked for it out of habit rather than conviction. A routine glance at names scrawled by visitors, a small archaeology of handwriting. Lewis stood beside me, shifting from foot to foot, the way he does when the scent of old paper begins to press on his patience. The page opened to the night Joanna had crossed Magdalen Bridge with that unsettled look. Only 3 signatures stood between the usual entries of tradesmen and delivery vans. 2 were known to the porter, the third unfurled in a looping, almost literary hand. A. Lawfarn. The initial neat, the surname slightly hurried, as though its writer had been unsure whether to finish the flourish. I let my finger rest under the name. Lafarn, like the Welsh town Dylan Thomas had haunted, a place where tides and poetry met. But this was St. Anselm's, not Carmarthenshire, and the visitor had left no address, no car registration, an alias written with self-conscious charm. I asked the porter if he remembered the person. He frowned into the register as though it might yield a face. A tall man, perhaps, or a woman. Hard to say. The mist that evening had been thick. As we left the lodge, Lewis remarked that it could be nothing more than a scholar with a romantic name. I let him speak without answer because the deduction, faint but persistent, had already begun its whisper. Joanna's laughter, Kerr's death, a footnote that refused to stay in the margin. We walked across the quad toward Kerr's rooms. The flagstones still held the day's drizzle, and my reflection floated beside me in each shallow puddle. Inside, the air had the papery scent of a library sealed too long. Books leaned against each other like conspirators, their spines cracked from use. On Kerr's desk, a half-finished crossword lay open, the pencil rolled to the floor as if dropped mid-thought. I bent over it. A few answers inked in Kerr's thin script, others blank. My eyes moved to the clue, dead center. Silent laughter's echo. 7. No entry. The rest of the puzzle symmetrical, precise, but this space gaped like a missing tooth. Lewis hovered at the door, reading aloud a note pinned to the wall about a lecture on Beowulf. I barely heard him. My mind began to sift through synonyms. Mirthless chuckle, noiseless amusement, the old riddles of Exeter Book. There is an Anglo-Saxon word for laughter that carries sorrow's root. Kerr had once explained it to a room of undergraduates, his voice dry as chalk. I imagined him here, pencil poised, the guest called Lafarn somewhere nearby. Was the clue a coincidence or a conversation? I picked up the pencil and sketched in one possibility, smiling. It did not fit. 7 letters. Muffler. Tittery. Nonsense. I set the pencil down. The window rattled faintly in its frame. Outside, students crossed the quad under umbrellas, their gowns lifting like dark wings. Kerr's kettle sat cold on the hob, a teacup ring marking the desk beside the crossword. Everything in the room felt paused mid-sentence. Lewis asked if I thought Lafarn had visited Kerr. I said perhaps, though the register gave no hour. He said Joanna had mentioned hearing the laugh around 10. He said it like a casual remark, but it pricked me. 10 o'clock. The clue. 10 across. I looked back at the crossword. The number beside the clue was indeed 10. A small symmetry, meaningless maybe, but it lodged there. I closed the book of puzzles gently, as one closes the eyes of the dead. The register, the alias, the clue about silent laughter, fragments of a private joke or a coded threat. Kerr had been a man of riddles. Someone had answered him in kind. When we stepped back into the corridor, the floorboards creaked as though recording our steps. I thought of Joanna on the bridge, of a sound without a source, and of Kerr bending over his crossword, waiting for an answer that never came. In my pocket, the copied name, A. Lafarn, felt heavier than paper, as if carrying a tide all its own. It was Lewis who found the envelope, not I. We were seated in the bursar's office, a low room smelling of old varnish and the faint sweetness of candle grease, the windows misted from the morning rain. He opened a drawer, searching for a map of the library extension, and instead drew out Kerr's revised will, neatly folded, sealed with a modest stamp as though secrecy were unnecessary. He handed it to me with that mixture of satisfaction and apology he adopts when stumbling across something too interesting to ignore. Inside, Kerr had left the bulk of his rare manuscripts to the forthcoming library wing, the wing funded by Anthony Miles. The handwriting was deliberate, not the cramped scrawl of a man hurrying his affairs. Each bequest listed with a scholar's precision, as if he were cataloguing rather than bequeathing. Lewis muttered that it looked tidy enough, but I heard the undertone, motive. Miles had everything to gain from an association with Kerr's name. Reputation, prestige, perhaps a way to rinse certain funds under the pretext of culture. Kerr's manuscripts were not just old paper, they were credentials, bargaining chips, proof of lineage. I stared at the signature. It was dated 3 weeks before Kerr's death. The ink had faded slightly at the edges, as though the paper had been left too close to sunlight. My deduction was small but insistent. Miles had begun his funding campaign months earlier, yet the will was changed only recently. Who had prompted whom? We stepped back into the quadrangle where the rain was turning the gravel to grey sugar. Students crossed with umbrellas like muted bells. In the cloister we found Eleanor Ross, essays clutched to her as always, her face pale against the stone. She said quietly that Kerr had threatened Baines over exam irregularities, a whisper of scandal, half in pity, half in accusation. Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, as though measuring how much I already knew. Then she moved away, skirts brushing the carved Latin on the wall. Lewis wrote in his notebook, frowning. He said we had 2 lines now, Miles and money, Baines and blackmail. He said it like an arithmetic problem, expecting a sum. I nodded, but the laughter detail still hovered like a watermark across the page. Kerr's heart might have failed, but hearts fail under many kinds of weight. Financial, moral, or the sudden shock of something unseen. We walked through the skeleton of the new wing, its foundation trenches dark with rainwater, boards creaking underfoot. The smell of wet timber and concrete dust mingled with the faint perfume of ivy from the garden wall. A foreman's plan lay on a trestle table, edges curling. Lewis remarked that the wing would overshadow the old reading room once built. I noticed a small brass plaque already affixed to an unfinished doorway, Miles' Library Wing, Knowledge Unbound. The word unbound caught me. Unbound manuscripts are vulnerable to misplacement, alteration, disappearance. In the half-light, the wing resembled a stage before scenery is painted. I tried to picture Kerr's manuscripts here, stacked in glass cases under Miles' name. I imagined Baines walking past, knowing his irregularities hidden only by Kerr's discretion. The architecture seemed complicit, each arch a raised eyebrow. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him that wills can be rewritten as easily as lectures, and blackmail is a currency scholars know how to spend. He laughed under his breath, a sound more like a cough. I thought again of Joanna Field hearing laughter where none should be. We left the site and crossed back into the main library. The floorboards creaked with the familiar sound of footsteps not our own. I opened the crossword I had taken from Kerr's desk, still unfinished. The clue about silent laughter remained blank. My pencil hovered, then wrote in choked mirth. It fit the squares, but not the spirit. I rubbed it out, leaving only a grey smudge like ash. As evening fell, the quad darkened into a kind of waiting room. Miles's motives, Baines's scandal, Eleanor's guarded disclosures. All plausible, all incomplete. The will and the wing had opened doors, but not the one I needed. I felt the case folding around me like those gardens, walls within walls, echoing footsteps that belonged to no one yet, and always that unclaimed laughter, circling the margins, refusing to name itself. I'd been reading too long in Kerr's rooms, the fire gone cold and the shadows sharpening into corners. The letter lay among his papers, its ink the color of dried violets, a hand I could not immediately place. The phrasing was careful, almost intimate, speaking of late nights, of borrowed books, of a gratitude that seemed to hover just beyond propriety. It was signed only J. Field. In the brittle stillness of that hour, I let the implication bloom. Librarian and scholar, secluded corridors, an affair conducted under the hum of fluorescent light. Lewis had already gone. He dislikes the way libraries seem to breathe after dark. Alone, I weighed the letter against the image of Joanna on Magdalen Bridge, her pencil moving with furtive speed. Desire often writes itself in margins. I thought perhaps I had found the margin at last. Morning brought a damp light and the smell of wet slate. I found Joanna in the reading room, bent over a stack of catalogues, her hair caught back with a simple pin. The room held its usual hush of turning pages and muted coughs. She looked up briefly, a flicker of recognition, then lowered her eyes again. I approached as one might approach a hesitant witness, yet a part of me, unacknowledged until then, approached as a man. I spoke of Kerr obliquely at first. His taste in Anglo-Saxon riddles, his habit of leaving books unreturned, then let the question shape itself from casualness. He must have valued your help, I said, those late evenings in the stacks. She looked puzzled, then replied she had seen him perhaps twice in her life, both times at public lectures. I felt my theory wobble like a badly set bridge. The letter on Kerr's desk had spoken of borrowed volumes. I pressed gently, asking whether she had ever lent him books from her private collection. She smiled, faint and dry, and said she owned no such treasures. She said her note had been a simple acknowledgement for his donation to the staff library fund, a courtesy only. I had misread gratitude as passion. The deduction, if it could still be called that, collapsed into a soft embarrassment. Yet pride, like whiskey, burns before it settles. I reached for a last test, a line of Hardy that Kerr himself had once misquoted to flirt with Eleanor Ross. And at night she heard his footstep on the stair. Joanna corrected me at once, gently, without triumph. Hardy never wrote it that way, she said. The line is from Satires of Circumstance, and it ends differently. Her voice was calm, unpracticed, but sure. Something in me shifted then, not only the case but the mirror it held up. I'd projected a romance where none existed, had turned a courteous librarian into a clandestine lover because the story fit some need of mine for symmetry. We build narratives as easily as we solve crosswords, but the wrong letters still look persuasive in the grid. She returned to her catalogues, the faintest flush on her cheeks from speaking so directly. I stood there longer than necessary, noticing the dust motes lifting through a shaft of light, the smell of old bindings sweet as faded fruit. The room's silence grew around us until even my own thoughts seemed immodest. I left without another question. Outside, the quad was slick with rain and the gargoyles on the library facade gleamed darkly, mouths open in perpetual mockery. In my pocket, the misread letter felt suddenly lighter, like a prop from a discarded play. Later, over a solitary lunch at the King's Arms, I opened the crossword again. The clue about silent laughter still waited. This time I penciled in muted mirth. It fit the squares but left a residue of doubt, as all provisional answers do. I thought of Joanna's quiet correction, her refusal of my narrative. Intelligence sometimes arrives as restraint rather than display. Perhaps she too had noticed something in Kerr's death, but lacked the name for it. Perhaps her diary held more than she had told me. Or perhaps I was once again mistaking courtesy for conspiracy. Through the pub window, rain drifted across the cobbles like erased handwriting. I finished my pint slowly, feeling the case rearrange itself in silence, the grid emptying and refilling in my mind. In the distance, a bell tolled, muffled, like laughter caught in a sleeve. Lewis found it while I was still staring at the window's grey sheen. We had been allowed into Kerr's rooms again, the air thicker now, with the scent of rain-damp books and a trace of something medicinal that clung to the curtains. Lewis bent to straighten a stack of lecture notes and came up holding a slim diary, its calfskin cover rubbed soft at the edges. He flipped it open with a practiced thumb and said there was something odd about the date of the disturbance. The entry for that night had been excised, not torn, but cut with care. A neat rectangle missing from the binding, like a pane of glass removed from a frame. The pages before and after remained, filled with Kerr's spidery script, trivial appointments, borrowed texts, an occasional aphorism about riddles or wine. But the square of absence glared more than any confession could. Lewis muttered that perhaps Kerr had destroyed it himself. I said perhaps, though my attention had already shifted to the faint indentations left behind on the sheet beneath. Words ghost onto paper even after their surface is gone. The palimpsest holds its own memory. I angled the book toward the light leaking from the leaded window. The markings lay shallow as breath, unreadable yet suggestive. Loops, thorns, a vertical stroke. We sent for Joanna Field, whose shift in the library ended at noon. She arrived with a damp umbrella and that same watchful composure, as if every corridor concealed an examiner. I asked whether she had ever seen Kerr writing in Old English. She said weeks before she had glimpsed a strange couplet penciled into the margin of a borrowed volume. Something about a man who laughs without sound. She had not understood it, but remembered the shape of the letters, their ancient crookedness. I turned the diary again under the window. The indentations matched her description, a coded rhythm of half-familiar symbols. With a soft pencil, I shaded across the page until faint outlines surfaced like ripples under silt. Not a full text, only fragments, but enough. Semon the hleactor ne hlide, the man who laughs without sound. The phrase moved through me like a draft from a crypt. It echoed Joanna's hearing on the bridge, Kerr's unfinished crossword, the alias in the register. Even across centuries the riddle persisted, slipping between languages like a fugitive. Lewis asked what it meant. I said only that it was an old puzzle whose answer had been lost or miscopied. He said it sounded like nonsense. He always says that when the pattern is still mist rather than stone. I asked Joanna why she had remembered the couplet so exactly. She hesitated, then said it had unsettled her, though she could not explain why. She spoke softly, but her hands tightened on the umbrella handle until her knuckles whitened. I noted the gesture, fear perhaps, or guilt, but also the tension of someone who recognizes an echo but cannot name its source. When she left, the room felt emptier than before. Lewis sat at the desk making notes, his handwriting blunt and decisive. I stayed by the window, diary open, pencil resting across the margin like a compassed needle. My deduction was still only a tremor. Kerr had not been merely reading about laughter without sound. He had been mapping it, perhaps corresponding with someone who used it as a sign. The missing page was not an erasure, but a message withdrawn. Outside, the rain slackened into a fine mist. The quad below spread its damp stone like an open manuscript, students moving across it as small annotations. From somewhere in the college, a bell tolled a half-hour late, its sound muffled as though swallowed by cloth. I closed the diary and placed it back on the desk. The shaded fragments remained, a pale echo of what Kerr had written, like a voice traveling through time but stripped of breath. I thought again of the crossword clue waiting on my own table. Silent laughter's echo. Answers are always provisional. Only the grid remains. Lewis asked if we were any nearer. I said nearer perhaps to the question rather than the answer. He shook his head, but I saw him glance once more at the excised page, as if even he could feel the absence vibrating there. In that room of rain, books, and unspoken riddles, it seemed for a moment that the centuries had folded and the man who laughs without sound stood just behind us, smiling invisibly. Night had draped itself across the city like an old velvet curtain. From my window, the spires stood in silhouette, their edges blurred by a fine drizzle that refused to stop. I had drawn the blinds halfway, letting the street lamp's amber leak into the room in a narrow band. On the gramophone, Wagner turned slowly, the prelude to Tristan breathing out its suspended longing. I sat with a glass of claret whose color recalled something private, ink on an old letter, perhaps, or the blush on a cheek long vanished from memory. The day's evidence lay on my table in uneven stacks. Kerr's diary with its excised page, the guest register with its playful alias, my own notebook scribbled with phrases like silent laughter, Old English couplet, Miles's wing. Each item sat separate, yet in my mind they shuffled themselves like a deck of misprinted cards, images aligning only to shift again. I sipped the wine and felt the tannins travel upward, slow and dry as a string section climbing. Unseen presences filled the flat as they always did when a case reached this limbo. Voices of suspects, remembered gestures, a librarian's careful pencil, the faintest quiver of a smile in a corridor. Lovers, too, though lover is too generous a word. Faces I had almost reached for but never held. Women whose intelligence drew me like a problem set, but whose lives were always elsewhere. They drifted now through the music, half shadow, half memory. I let my thoughts return to Joanna Field, to the moment she corrected my misquoted Hardy. A small act, but it had unsettled me. I had seen her as an annotation to Kerr's life. Instead, she had been her own text, self-contained. Eleanor Ross with her ink-stained wrist, Marcus Baines with his unlit cigarette, Anthony Miles polishing his benefaction like a brass plate. They too moved through the music, each one a motif waiting for resolution. I drew a pencil idly across the margin of my notebook and wrote the clue again. Silent laughter's echo. 7. My mind offered a series of half-answers. Choked mirth, muted jest, echo grin. But none sat right. The pencil traced circles instead of letters, a habit from childhood. Wagner's chord hung unresolved. The wine glass caught the lamplight in a dull red crescent. The phone rang then, breaking the suspended harmony. Its bell sounded tinny, officious. Stranger's voice came through, softened by distance but still carrying that mixture of command and camaraderie. He spoke of routine matters, a budget line for overtime, a reminder about some minor court appearance, a question about whether I needed more support on the Kerr case. His tone was casual, but beneath it lay the quiet reprimand of a man who knows his inspector works alone too often. I answered with polite fragments, half listening. I could hear a kettle whistling at his end, or perhaps a radio. His domestic sounds always struck me like photographs of a country I could not visit. He said Lewis had filed a preliminary report, that the chief superintendent wanted a briefing. I said I would draft something tomorrow. He said, "Take care of yourself, old man." Then the line clicked empty. The room felt larger after the call, as though the voice had been holding the walls together. Wagner's prelude continued its endless yearning. I topped up the claret and stood at the window, looking out at the rain glossing the cobblestones below. A student hurried past under a coat, clutching a book like a talisman. I thought then of the man who laughs without sound, of Kerr shading his diary page, of a guest calling himself Loffarn. Across centuries riddles survive because someone chooses to copy them. Across lives, secrets persist because someone chooses silence. The glass warmed in my hand. The wine's color deepened as though remembering. I turned back to the table and arranged the evidence once more. this time aligning the edges so that the gaps between them formed a clean cross. A superstition, perhaps, or a way to coax the pattern from hiding. The music swelled and then fell back into quiet, unresolved. I felt myself suspended there with it, between clue and answer, between presence and echo. And for a moment, the whole case seemed to breathe like a single, long chord held in the dark. The reception had been arranged to look spontaneous, but the scent of polish and the quiet rigidity of the flower arrangements betrayed the committee's hand. We gathered in the senior common room under a ceiling darkened by centuries of pipe smoke. Outside, the quad was drenched and glimmering. Inside, the warmth of wine and conversation clung like a borrowed coat. I stood near the mantel with a glass of indifferent sherry, watching the way people gravitated to one another, donors to tutors, junior lecturers to patrons, everyone performing their subtle negotiations. Marcus Baines entered late, his hair damp, the cuffs of his jacket frayed but brushed. He moved among the guests with a confidence that was almost insolent. When he reached our cluster by the window, he launched into a story about a lost manuscript, his voice pitched to entertain rather than confess. And then, as if to garnish his anecdote, he quoted Auden, a line from one of the early poems about laughter and ghosts of memory. The words fell neatly, but one was wrong. He said the echo of the unspeaking crowd, when the line should have been the echo of the unhearing crowd. A small shift, but to me it rang like a bell struck off pitch. I felt the wine pause on my tongue. That variant existed only in an obscure first printing, a slim grey volume held in the locked stacks Joanna Field supervised. Kerr had once mentioned it to me in passing, marveling at how Auden's publisher had corrected the misprint in later editions. The error had always amused him. I said lightly that Baines had an interesting source for his quotations. He smiled without looking at me, saying the line had stuck in his head from years back. He turned to refill his glass, but the tips of his ears had reddened. That was the deduction's first tremor. The room hummed with polite laughter and the clink of cutlery on canapes. Eleanor Ross drifted past, essays tucked under her arm as if she could not part from them even here. Anthony Miles stood by the decanters, listening but not drinking, his smile arranged with bankerly precision. Joanna was absent, still cataloguing in the library. I felt her absence like a missing note. Baines began another anecdote, but I had stopped listening. My mind leapt sideways, aligning the misquote with the alias in the register. Laugh on. Dylan Thomas's Welsh Refuge, a name chosen by someone who understood literary geography. The crossword clue, Silent Laughter's Echo. Kerr's diary fragment, The Man Who Laughs Without Sound. Each piece a small, deliberate nudge toward a pattern of amusement and menace. I set down my glass and drifted to the bookcase against the far wall. The spines there were purely decorative, Victorian sermons bound to look respectable. My fingers traced the dust ridge where a real volume might have been removed. Behind me, Baines' voice rose and fell like a tutor rehearsing a lecture, but I heard only its echo, unspeaking instead of unhearing. Someone with access to that early Auden had staged more than a quotation. They had staged an auditory illusion, a ghost of laughter designed to reach Kerr's brittle heart. Lewis found me there and muttered that I looked as if I'd seen a ghost. I said perhaps I had, though only of syntax. He asked if I was any nearer to an answer. I told him nearer to a question that might finally be the right one. He frowned, but let it pass, his gaze following Baines across the room. The reception began to thin. Umbrellas opened in the doorway. Coats flapped damply as guests retreated into the drizzle. The room smelled of extinguished candles and overripe fruit. I remained by the mantel, turning the misquote over like a coin between my fingers. In my notebook later, I would draw a small arrow from Laugh On to Auden, from echo to unspeaking, a chain of marginalia pointing toward a motive not yet named. As the last guests left, the common room settled into a hush, broken only by the clock's uneven tick. I thought of Kerr's unfinished crossword, of Joanna in the locked stacks, of Baines's careless substitution. In a world built on footnotes and additions, a single misprinted word can open a door. I felt the case shift again, like a chord resolving in the dark, yet the melody still incomplete. Dawn arrived thin and colorless, a paper sky over the college roofs. The flagstones of St. Anselm's held the nights damp like ink in blotting paper. I'd asked the porter to leave the gates unlatched. He had raised an eyebrow but complied. The quad was empty now, except for a crow hopping between puddles, its feathers blacker than the lead drain pipes. This was the hour when the city felt neither past nor present, when sound carried as if through a shell. I began at the arch, where Joanna would have entered after crossing Magdalen Bridge. My breath came out as a mist, quickly lost among the stone. I walked the route she had described, the cloister running parallel to the gardens, then a dogleg beneath a gallery of carved heads whose mouths opened in silent admonition. Each step echoed differently depending on the angle of the vaulting. Even a whisper here could seem like a shout. In the corner of the cloister, a small brass plaque caught the first grey light. It announced an audio heritage trail, temporarily closed. The screws were rusted, but the wiring still snaked into the wall. I remembered a footnote in the college guidebook about an exhibit that once played choral fragments for visitors. Latin chants, lectures from dead dons, the murmuring of bees in the botanic garden. No one had thought to remove it entirely. I crouched, tracing the base of the wall with a gloved hand. The grille above the plaque was disguised as a ventilation slot, but bore the fine mesh of a speaker. It faced outward toward the path Joanna had taken, as if waiting for an audience. Dust had gathered in the corners, but the mesh was free of cobwebs, the way a neglected instrument still gleams at the mouthpiece. Behind me, the crow cawed once, a raw sound that bounced off the cloister and returned as something stranger. I imagined a recording of laughter played here at night, rising like vapor, unplaceable. Kerr, hearing it from his rooms, stepping toward the window. Joanna pausing on the bridge, the riddle's echo made into mechanism. I rose slowly, knees protesting. Along the baseboard near the wiring cupboard, a scatter of scuff marks curved in and out. The sole of a shoe dragged sideways, perhaps while crouching. The porter had mentioned no workmen at night. Someone had been here recently, adjusting, perhaps rehearsing. I noted the pattern in my small notebook. 3 marks close together, then a gap, then another. It looked oddly like the spacing of letters in a code. Inside the cupboard, the wiring hung like veins. A small cassette deck rested on a shelf, its lid closed but a label curling on its side. I did not open it. Instead, I shut the cupboard gently and stood for a long moment, listening. The silence felt taut, as if something had only just stopped playing. I retraced my steps along the cloister, past the carved heads, out into the quad. The morning light had brightened enough to show my reflection faintly in the library windows, a man alone, coat collar raised, notebook in hand. I thought of Kerr bent over his crossword, of Baines quoting Whodunit, of Joanna's pencil halting mid-word. The deduction was no longer supernatural. Someone with access had built an illusion from the college's own history, turning an abandoned exhibit into a stage. But why? Fear as blackmail, a prank that became a weapon. The motive hovered just beyond reach like a final answer you sense but cannot name. The bells of St. Mary's struck the quarter, their sound slow and watery. A student on a bicycle cut across the far side of the quad, head down, unaware of me. I felt as if I were watching a film run backwards, retracing not only Joanna's steps, but Kerr's final hours, the laughter retreating into tape hiss. Back at the arch, I paused, looking once more at the speaker's mesh. In the weak daylight, it resembled a mouth-frozen mid-laugh. I wrote a single word beneath the scuff-mark sketch in my notebook. Projection. Then I closed it. The case was less a haunting now than a performance, yet the script remained unread. The crow rose suddenly, wings loud in the cloistered air, and the sound of its departure echoed longer than it should have, as if the college itself were rehearsing some forgotten line. It was not in the senior common room that I chose to meet Baines, but in the lesser-known reading cellars beneath the old library, where the light arrives only through a grating at street level and smells of wet brick and paper dust. Down there, even footsteps hesitate. I had asked him to come on the pretext of clarifying a citation. He came because pride does not allow a man to look evasive. He stood by a table marked Reshelve, his fingers drumming an idle rhythm on a pile of journals. Without the audience of a reception, his bravado looked threadbare. The cuffs of his shirt were frayed, and his eyes, usually sharp with irony, had a bleary caution. I placed my notebook on the table but did not open it. I began without preamble, and speaking of Kerr's diary, of the missing page, of the laughter that was not laughter. He tried a small smile, saying he had no idea what I meant. But when I mentioned the Auden misquote, his knuckles whitened on the journals. I said the variant existed only in a single early edition, kept under lock, an edition he had consulted under Joanna's credentials. He stared at the floor then, as if reading a footnote invisible to me. The confession arrived not as drama, but as a slow erosion. He spoke of translations hurried in youth, shortcuts taken when reputation mattered more than rigor. Kerr had discovered the falsifications, he said, and threatened to bring them before the board. I asked if that was why he created the ghost laugh. He said it had been meant only as a warning, an unsettler. Kerr's heart, he thought, could handle a scare. He had taken a recording from the college's defunct audio exhibit, spliced it with his own laughter, wired it to play at chosen intervals from the cloister speaker. A scholar's prank, he called it, though his voice cracked on the word. I asked about the manuscripts and the will, whether Miles had been complicit. He shook his head quickly. Miles was a distraction, nothing more. He said Kerr's bequest had been a final attempt at securing a legacy untainted by scandal. He said the wing would have his name, but not his shame. As he spoke, I watched the small gestures, the thumb worrying the seam of his jacket, the eyes flicking to the door at each distant creak. Even now he clung to the belief that this could be contained like a misprint corrected in the next edition. The deduction flickered in me. He had not meant to kill Kerr, but had staged a performance whose script he could not control. Silence pooled between us, thick as the smell of damp paper. Somewhere above, a cart rattled over cobbles. The sound descended as a dull echo through the grating. He said he had once admired Kerr, had envied his patience with words. He said he had been cornered by the younger self who had cut corners and by the older man who had lost the nerve to confess. I told him the board would not be merciful, but he only nodded as if that were already known. His brilliance had always contained its own undoing, a riddle solved at the cost of its answer. When he left the cellar, he did not look back. His footsteps receded up the stone stair, then vanished into the muted thunder of rain on the courtyard above. I remained a while longer among the shelves, listening to the building breathe. On the table lay a single sheet of scrap paper on which Baines had scrawled a phrase during our talk. An old Anglo-Saxon line about a man laughing unseen. He had underlined it once, hard enough to dent the wood beneath. I traced the groove with my finger, thinking of Kerr's unfinished crossword, of Joanna's diary entry, of the speaker's mesh like a mouth mid-laugh. The cellar's clock ticked irregularly. I poured a small measure from the hip flask I keep for such moments, the claret warm and metallic on the tongue. In the wavering light I felt no triumph, only the weight of two men's pride converging across time, Kerr's refusing to let a fraud persist, and Baines's refusing to admit his own. Outside, Rain blurred the stained glass windows into unreadable script. The case had shifted from echo to voice at last, yet what remained in the silence was not justice, but a faint, exhausted sympathy. The inquest took place in the oak-paneled hall whose walls had absorbed centuries of arguments and excuses. Even before the coroner spoke, the air smelt of old wood, cold ink and the faint metallic tang of damp umbrellas propped beneath the benches. Rain had stopped, but its memory clung to the coats and gowns, a low mist rising from them like a second congregation. I stood at the narrow table, my notes arranged in the same careful pattern I'd used on Kerr's desk weeks before. The coroner asked for a summary. I gave it in a tone so dry it felt borrowed. The hidden speaker in the cloister, the alias in the register, the diary page recovered by shading, the early edition of Auden misquoted in public, the recording of laughter played at night. Baines had admitted the sequence, though not the consequence. He sat a few feet away now, head bowed, fingers interlaced as if in prayer. As I spoke, the word laughter kept recurring, an involuntary refrain. Each time it left my mouth, it felt emptier, stripped of amusement, a hollow sound that traveled across the hall like wind between columns. I saw the jurors exchange brief looks. To them it was a case of harassment turned fatal, a scholar's mischief ending in a weak heart's failure. But to me it was something thinner, a performance of absence, a joke without its punchline. Joanna Field sat at the back, her diary closed on her lap. She had given her statement quietly, answering only what was asked. No one here would know she had been the first to hear the laugh on Magdalen Bridge. Her face was unreadable, not blank, but deliberately still, like a page waiting for annotation. When the coroner closed his file and the clerk called the next matter, the hall shifted in a low rustle of papers, chairs scraping against the oak floor. Baines was led out a side door. I packed my notes slowly, feeling the weight of each sheet. The evidence was complete. The story remained partial. Outside, the sky had brightened without warmth. Joanna walked ahead of me across the courtyard, her bicycle at her side. She did not look back. I followed at a distance, not from duty, but from a quiet impulse I could not name. The gatekeeper lifted the latch, and she passed into the street, her coat catching the wind. Magdalen Bridge appeared through the thinning mist. The river below moved sluggish and opaque, as if storing secrets. Students hurried past us carrying folders, their laughter muted and ordinary. Joanna paused at the balustrade where she had once stopped, the place where the case had begun to breathe. She looked out across the water. This time she wrote nothing. The wind stirred her hair, but no echo rose from the cloisters. I stood further back under the arch, hands in my pockets. The city sounded different now. Bicycle bells, a bus braking, the muted bells of St. Mary's, but nothing else. No spectral laugh, no phantom presence. Just weather and stone. I thought of Kerr, of the riddle he had copied in his diary, the man who laughs without sound. I thought of Baines bending over the cassette deck, of his pride and his fear. I thought of myself misreading a librarian's courtesy as intimacy, building my own pattern of ghosts. Perhaps we all had. Joanna turned and wheeled her bicycle onward, disappearing into the traffic of High Street. I stayed a moment longer, watching the river's surface crease and smooth again. A gust of wind moved through the arch, and for an instant it almost shaped a sound, but it was only air shifting against stone. I opened my notebook one last time and wrote a single line from the lost poem, the letters small and slanting. He who laughs unseen leaves no echo. The pencil hovered. Then I closed the book. The case was finished, but the silence it left felt larger than the hall where I had spoken. In Oxford, even wind can seem like memory turning a page.